The first night in the new house was supposed to be special. We'd been saving for years, scrimping and cutting corners to afford our first place. It wasn't a mansion, not even close, but it was ours. A two-bedroom fixer-upper on the edge of a small town called Fairview Hollow. Quiet, peaceful, or so we thought. It started with the door. We were unpacking boxes in the living room when the front door slammed shut on its own, hard enough to rattle the windows. We both jumped, the noise breaking the silence. I looked at Emma, my fiancée, her face pale as she stared at the now-closed door. "Wind," I said quickly, trying to brush it off, but the air outside was still, and the windows weren't open. I walked over, tugging the door to make sure it was latched properly. It was locked. "Old house," I said, forcing a smile. "These things settle." Emma nodded, but her expression didn't change. That night we lay in bed, both too exhausted to talk about it. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside, filtering through the blinds. But I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes, made my skin crawl. Around 2 a.m. I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from downstairs. At first I thought it was just the wind again, but it was too deliberate. 2 taps, a pause, then 3 more. I sat up, my heart pounding. Emma stirred beside me, her voice groggy. "What's wrong? Do you hear that?" I whispered. She listened for a moment, her brow furrowing. Then it came again, 2 taps, pause, 3 more. "What is that?" she asked, her voice shaking. I didn't answer. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I crept toward the stairs. The tapping stopped the moment I stepped into the hallway. The house was silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I moved slowly, my bare feet making no sound on the cold wooden floor. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I scanned the room. Nothing. The living room was exactly as we'd left it. Boxes stacked against the walls, furniture half arranged, the front door closed and locked. But then I saw it. A single handprint, smeared in dust, on the glass of the back door. It was small, like a child's hand, but there were no children in the house. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The handprint was on the inside of the glass. I backed away, my flashlight trembling as I pointed it at the door. The light caught something else. A small object lying on the floor just in front of the door. It was an old key, tarnished and slightly bent, the kind you'd find in an antique chest or an old lockbox. I didn't remember seeing it there before. I crouched down, picking it up carefully. The metal was cold, almost unnaturally so, and as I turned it over in my hand, I noticed something etched into the surface. A single word. "Leave." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned quickly, scanning the room. It was empty. I ran back upstairs, my heart racing as I locked the bedroom door behind me. Emma was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide. "What happened?" she asked. I didn't know how to answer. "Nothing," I lied, sliding the key into the drawer of the nightstand. She didn't believe me, but she didn't press. We both lay awake the rest of the night, listening to every sound the house made. The next morning, I went outside to check the yard, hoping to find some explanation. Anything that would make sense. The grass was damp with dew, and the air was crisp and cold. But as I walked toward the back of the house, I stopped dead in my tracks. There were footprints in the dirt leading away from the back door. They were small, like a child's, but there was something wrong about them. The prints weren't deep, but they stretched impossibly far, like whoever made them was walking on the tips of their toes. I followed the trail to the edge of the yard, where they disappeared into the woods. The trees loomed, their bare branches clawing at the sky. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker, a shadow darting between the trees. "Everything okay?" I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Emma was standing on the back porch, her arms crossed against the cold. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just checking the yard." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press. As we walked back inside, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The woods were still, the shadows stretching long in the morning light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us. That night, as we were unpacking, Emma found something strange in the kitchen. The old key I'd hidden in the nightstand drawer was sitting on the counter. Neither of us had touched it. The key sitting on the kitchen counter was the last straw for Emma. She slammed it down, her face pale and tense. "I'm done pretending this is normal," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't argue. There was no logical explanation for how the key had gotten there. But the unease in the pit of my stomach told me that this wasn't just about the key anymore. Someone had been in our house. That night, we decided to sleep in shifts. Emma stayed in the bedroom, her phone clutched in her hand, while I sat on the couch in the living room, a baseball bat resting across my lap. The hours dragged by, the silence of the house broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant hoot of an owl. I kept telling myself it was just an old house settling into the cold. But the pit in my stomach wouldn't go away. Around 3 a.m. I heard it. A faint scraping sound, coming from the basement. I froze, gripping the bat tighter as I strained to listen. The noise was rhythmic, like metal dragging against concrete. I thought about waking Emma, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. For a moment I considered ignoring it. But then it came again, louder this time, and my curiosity or stupidity got the better of me. I crept toward the basement door, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, a faint draft of cold air seeping through the gap. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and flicked on the light. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast harsh shadows across the concrete walls. The basement was unfinished, cluttered with old furniture and boxes left behind by the previous owners. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. But as I descended the stairs, the metallic scraping sound started again, louder and more deliberate. It was coming from the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of old crates. I tightened my grip on the bat, every instinct screaming at me to go back upstairs. But I kept moving, the sound growing louder with each step. When I reached the crates, I hesitated, my breath fogging in the cold air. Slowly, I nudged one of the crates aside, revealing an old metal grate embedded in the floor. The grate was small, barely big enough for a child to fit through, but the bars were bent, as if someone had pried them apart. The scraping sound stopped the moment I saw it. I crouched down, shining my phone's flashlight into the hole. The space beneath the grate was dark and narrow, like a crawl space, and the air smelled damp and metallic. Then I saw it. A small, rusted knife, lying on the dirt floor beneath the grate. Beside it was a piece of torn fabric, stained dark with something I didn't want to think about. My stomach churned as I stood up, backing away from the hole. Suddenly, the basement light flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Then I heard it. A faint, ragged breath, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, swinging the bat wildly, but the space was empty. The sound of footsteps echoed above me, heavy and deliberate, moving across the floor of the living room. "Emma!" I shouted, bolting up the stairs 2 at a time. When I burst into the living room, the footsteps stopped. The room was empty, but the front door was wide open, the cold night air spilling in. "Emma!" I called out, my voice cracking. I ran to the bedroom, my heart pounding, and found her sitting up in bed, clutching her phone. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to answer. The front door was still open when we stepped into the living room together, Emma gripping my arm tightly. I shut it and locked it, checking the windows and every other door in the house. Nothing was broken, and nothing seemed out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. After that night, we called a locksmith to install new locks and deadbolts on every door and window. For a while, things seemed to settle down. But a week later, Emma found something that sent us both into a panic. She was cleaning out the hall closet when she found a small, crumpled piece of paper tucked into the corner of the top shelf. When she unfolded it, her face went pale. It was a crude drawing of our house, with 2 stick figures standing in the front yard. A third figure stood in the doorway holding something that looked like a knife. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in shaky letters, was a single word. Soon. That night we heard the scraping sound again. But this time it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from the attic. The scraping sound from the attic was unmistakable. It started as a faint, irregular noise, like nails dragging across wood, and then grew louder, more deliberate. Emma and I stood frozen in the living room, staring at the ceiling as the sound moved directly above us. "We need to call the police," Emma whispered, clutching my arm. I nodded, pulling out my phone. But before I could dial, the scraping stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sound itself. We stared at each other, the air between us heavy with unspoken fear. "Stay here," I said, grabbing the baseball bat I'd left by the couch. "No way," Emma said, her voice firm. "I'm not letting you go up there alone." I hesitated but knew better than to argue. Together, we moved toward the attic hatch in the hallway ceiling. The pull string dangled like a noose, swaying slightly as if someone had just brushed past it. I reached up and yanked the string, the ladder unfolding with a groan. A rush of cold air spilled down from the attic, carrying with it the faint smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. I shone my flashlight into the dark opening, the beam cutting through the thick dust motes that swirled in the air. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The attic was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint creak of the house settling. I climbed the ladder slowly, each step making the wood groan under my weight. Emma followed close behind, her grip on my shirt so tight it almost hurt. The attic was cramped, the low ceiling forcing us to crouch as we moved across the wooden beams. Boxes and old furniture were piled haphazardly, their surfaces coated in a thick layer of dust. First, nothing seemed out of place. But then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a sleeping bag. It was filthy, the fabric torn and stained with dark, rust-colored spots. Beside it was a small pile of objects, a flashlight, an empty water bottle, and a crumpled fast food wrapper. Someone had been living up here. My stomach turned as I noticed something else. Pinned to the wooden beam above the sleeping bag were photographs. Dozens of them, all taken from inside our house. There were pictures of Emma cooking in the kitchen, of me sitting on the couch, of us sleeping in our bed. Some of the photos were recent, printed on glossy paper that still looked fresh. But others were old, faded and yellowed with time. In one of the older photos, a family sat on the front porch of our house, smiling brightly at the camera. A man, a woman, and a little girl. The same family from the framed photograph we'd found in the hallway closet when we moved in. Beneath the photos was a notebook, its cover worn and stained. I opened it cautiously, flipping through the pages. Each page was filled with erratic handwriting, the words almost illegible in some places. Most of it was nonsense. Ramblings about protecting the house and keeping them out. But one phrase kept repeating over and over, "The house belongs to me." As I turned the page, a small piece of paper fell out. I picked it up, my heart sinking as I realized what it was. It was another drawing, this one even cruder than the last. It showed two stick figures lying on the ground, their bodies covered in red scribbles. Above them stood a third figure holding what looked like a hammer. Beneath the drawing, in the same shaky handwriting, were the words, "I warned you. Let's go," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't argue. We climbed down the ladder as quickly as we could, slamming the attic hatch shut behind us. "We're calling the police," Emma said, grabbing her phone. This time I didn't try to stop her. The police arrived within 15 minutes, their blue and red lights casting eerie shadows on the walls as they swept through the house. They found the sleeping bag, the photographs, and the notebook. But they didn't find anyone in the attic. The officers assured us that whoever had been living there was long gone. But their words did little to ease our fear. We spent the night at a motel, too scared to stay in the house. The next morning, we returned with the intention of packing up and leaving for good. But when we walked through the front door, we realized we weren't alone. The furniture in the living room had been overturned, the couch cushions slashed open. On the wall above the fireplace, written in black spray paint, were the words, "You can't leave." And on the floor, lying in the middle of the room, was the notebook. Its cover was open to the last page, where a single phrase was scrawled in bold, jagged letters. "I'm already inside." The message on the wall, "You can't leave," made my blood run cold. Emma grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We're leaving," she whispered, her voice shaking. "No more packing. Let's just go." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. We backed out of the house, our footsteps slow and deliberate, as if we were afraid to make a sound. The air outside felt colder than it should have been for a sunny morning. As we got to the car, I noticed something strange. The driver's side door was slightly open. I hadn't left it like that. "Get in the car," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Emma climbed into the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the seatbelt. I checked the back seat, half expecting to find someone crouched there, but it was empty. Still, the unease in my stomach wouldn't go away. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, but it sputtered and died. "What's wrong?" Emma asked, panic rising in her voice. "I don't know," I said, turning the key again. The engine cranked, stuttering like it was choking on something, but it wouldn't catch. "Try again," Emma urged, her voice breaking. I turned the key one last time, and the engine roared to life. Relief washed over me as I shifted into reverse. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my heart stop. In the upstairs window of the house, a figure was standing. They were partially obscured by the curtains, but there was no mistaking the pale face and dark eyes staring directly at us. "Go!" Emma screamed, her voice snapping me out of my paralysis. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as we tore out of the driveway. As we sped down the street, Emma kept looking over her shoulder, her face pale. "Do you think they're following us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, gripping the steering wheel tightly. When we finally reached the police station, we practically burst through the doors. The officer at the desk listened patiently as we recounted everything. The attic, the photos, the message on the wall. When we told him about the figure in the window, his expression darkened. "You did the right thing coming here," he said, but there was a hesitation in his voice, like he didn't fully believe us. "We'll send someone to check the property," he added, but his tone made it clear he didn't expect to find much. We waited at the station for hours, too scared to go back to the house. When the officers returned, their report was brief. The attic was empty, the house was undisturbed, and the writing on the wall was gone. "How is that possible?" Emma demanded, her voice rising. The officer shrugged. "Maybe someone broke in and cleaned up after themselves," he suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We had nowhere else to go, so we reluctantly returned to the house. Everything looked normal at first. No overturned furniture, no messages on the walls. But the unease lingered, heavy and suffocating. That night, we decided to sleep in shifts again. Emma stayed in the bedroom while I sat in the living room, the baseball bat resting across my lap. By 2 a.m., I was struggling to stay awake, my eyes heavy. That's when I heard it. A faint creak, like a footstep on the floor above me. I froze, gripping the bat tightly as I listened. The sound came again, closer this time. I stood, my heart pounding, as the creaking turned into slow, deliberate footsteps. They were coming down the stairs. "Emma!" I shouted, backing away toward the front door. She ran into the living room, her face pale. "What is it?" Before I could answer, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I motioned for Emma to stay back as I approached the stairs, the bat raised. When I reached the bottom step, I peered up into the darkness. The staircase was empty, but at the top, resting on the landing, was the notebook. The same notebook the police had taken earlier. My stomach turned as I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the landing, I crouched down, picking up the notebook with trembling hands. The cover was scratched and torn, but it was unmistakably the same one. I flipped it open to the first page. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were the words, "I told you, you can't leave." Before I could process what I was reading, Emma screamed from downstairs. I dropped the notebook and ran back to the living room, my heart racing. The front door was wide open, and Emma was standing in the doorway, staring at something on the porch. When I reached her side, I saw what she was looking at. Sitting on the porch was a small, blood-stained hammer. The blood-stained hammer on the porch felt like a death sentence. Emma stumbled back into the house, her face pale as a ghost. "Lock the door," she whispered, her voice trembling. I slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt, my hands shaking. The hammer was still sitting there, a gruesome reminder that whoever had been tormenting us wasn't finished yet. "We need to get out of here," Emma said, pacing the room. "And go where?" I snapped, the tension and fear finally breaking through my voice. She stopped, looking at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't stay here. We're not safe." She was right. Every instinct told me to run, to grab whatever we could carry and get as far away as possible. But something about the hammer bothered me. It was a message, another twisted game meant to scare us. And whoever left it wasn't going to stop, no matter where we went. I grabbed the baseball bat and opened the door, stepping onto the porch before Emma could stop me. The hammer sat in the middle of the porch, the blood on its head dried and dark. I crouched down, my stomach churning as I noticed something tied to the handle. A folded piece of paper, secured with a piece of frayed string. I untied it with trembling fingers, unfolding the note. Scrawled in the same jagged handwriting were the words, "You're next." Behind the words was a crude drawing of two stick figures lying on the ground, their heads surrounded by red scribbles. I crumpled the note in my hand, my vision blurring with a mix of fear and rage. I turned to look at the yard, the street, the woods beyond. But the neighborhood was silent, the shadows stretching long in the moonlight. Whoever had been tormenting us was gone, at least for now. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. Emma was sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands. "What did it say?" she asked, her voice muffled. I hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. "It doesn't matter," I said finally. "We're leaving." She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy. "Tonight. Right now," I said, grabbing my car keys from the counter. We packed a few essentials, not bothering to sort through the mess of boxes we hadn't unpacked. By the time we were ready to leave, it was nearly 4 a.m. The house loomed behind us as we loaded the car, its dark windows staring back like empty eyes. As I turned the ignition, I glanced at the upstairs window, the same one where I'd seen the figure before. It was empty. We drove in silence, the tension in the car so thick it was suffocating. Emma stared out the window, her hands clenched in her lap. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or a shadowy figure following us. But the road behind us was empty, the streetlights casting long, lonely shadows. We ended up at a motel on the edge of town, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and peeling paint. It wasn't much, but it felt safer than the house. Emma fell asleep almost immediately, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. But I couldn't rest. I sat by the window, the baseball bat resting against the wall beside me, watching the parking lot for any signs of movement. The hours dragged by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, my phone buzzed. I grabbed it quickly, my heart pounding as I looked at the screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message contained only 2 words, "Not over." Attached to the message was a photograph. It was a picture of Emma and me, taken from outside the motel window, the window where I was sitting. I dropped the phone, my blood running cold as I looked out into the parking lot. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. We left the motel that morning, driving without any real destination. I don't know where we'll end up, but I know one thing for certain. Whoever or whatever is doing this won't stop. Not until they finish what they started.